Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast is your one-stop shop for fantasy football news and advice. Can't decide on who to draft on the first round? Going gaga on how to line up your team. Got you covered. Traditional leagues, Dynasty League, PPR League, IDP League, even Daily Fantasy Football League. Join us as we break down all the questions of fantasy football. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
And welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast, where we discuss everything in the world of fantasy football. As always, I'm Jeremiah. And today, I want to talk about probably the most questionable teams with, especially the quarterback position. And two teams that have been linked to Tony Romo this offseason. And that are the Denver Broncos and the Houston Texans. Well, John Elway, he was at the league NFL meetings, the annual meetings that they have every year, and he said that he's happy with Trevor Siemian and Paxton Lynch at quarterbacks. And it looks like he's not even interested in Tony Romo at all. Well, he couldn't really comment on Tony Romo because he's still on a contract with the Cowboys. But, he has expressed confidence in Trevor Siemian and Paxton Lynch. This is a team that has been linked to Tony Romo, and they look like they can compete, not just in the AFC West, but probably in the AFC if they were to add a strong quarterback to this team. Because we've seen how this defense has played. And we've seen how when this offense has the right guy to run the system, Peyton Manning, this can be a real good team. Well, last year, a lot of the Denver skill players kind of fell back a little bit because of the quarterback play of Trevor Siemian and Paxton Lynch. Trevor Siemian went 8-6 as a starter. He did throw 18 touchdowns, 10 interceptions. Paxton Lynch, on the other hand, he wasn't as good. He only had 2 starts. He went 1-1. He had 2 touchdowns, 1 interception, 497 yards. He didn't average a lot of fantasy points in those 2 games. Trevor Siemian, on the other hand, he was one of those guys that can get you at least 19 to 20, but he's probably a backup quarterback at best for your fantasy team. So it looks like that John Elway, it looks like he's very hiding it. He's hiding it very well that he doesn't want Tony Romo on this team. That Broncos have said they are not interested in bringing you Tony Romo on the trade. I could understand that part because then you will have to pay Tony Romo that huge salary that he's currently getting with the Cowboys. But if Tony Romo does not come to Denver, what does that do to this offense? Because when you got guys like Trevor Siemian and Paxton Lynch, and I expect Trevor Siemian to be the starter, unless Paxton Lynch dramatically improves this preseason, I can only see Trevor Siemian being the starter. So we've seen Trevor Siemian as a starter last year. He was 8-6, like I previously said. He was very average. He didn't do a whole lot. But what does that do for guys like Demaryius Thomas, Emmanuel Sanders? Well, Emmanuel Sanders, he did play pretty well, in this offense. Demaryius Thomas, he did play just as well too. But, Thomas was a receiver 2 at best. He was someone that's been highly well, I say highly, but he's been targeted in the mid rounds. And, with Trevor Siemian and Paxton Lynch, Demaryius Thomas didn't have a really bad year at all. He only had like 90 catches for 1,083 yards and 5 TDs, and he had 145 targets. So he did draw a lot of targets from these two signal callers here. And he didn't have many games in double digits. I think he had like 4 compared to 10. And, that will happen when the quarterback play does fall off. So he is a guy that didn't really have a lot of double digits performances, but, I think with Trevor Siemian now, one more year experience, he kind of knows the system now a little bit better. There's a chance for this offense to improve, but I don't think Trevor Siemian is the guy to take this team to the Super Bowl. He's not offensive juggernaut. So I would target Demaryius Thomas probably in the mid rounds again. I still think he's going to be very valuable. I think Demaryius Thomas has that receiver 2, receiver 1 upside, but I think he should be treated as a receiver 2. And he's definitely a very strong receiver to target around 5 or 4. So he's someone that can be very valuable to your team late in the year. And, Emmanuel Sanders, he's someone that's also had a great year as well. And, when you're looking at both of these receivers, Demaryius Thomas, Emmanuel Sanders, they're going to get a little bit undervalued, and that's because of the quarterback play. But if somehow Tony Romo does come to this team, Emmanuel Sanders and Demaryius Thomas are both receiver 1s. Because there's no other way to say it. They're receiver 1s. This offense will improve dramatically with Tony Romo. So, when I look at Sanders' stats with Denver last year, he did have 139 targets, pretty good, 79 receptions, 1,032 yards, and 5 touchdowns. So, he was productive. He wasn't as productive in his first year with Denver, but he was still productive. And, with those kind of numbers, he has to be treated as a receiver too, as well. He's someone that you can probably get a little bit later after Thomas. But I think honestly with these two guys, you gotta have to pick and choose, and you can't have both on your team. That's tough for me to have both. It was tough for me to have Thomas and Sanders on the same team because one of these guys are going to get most of the targets in one game. I don't think both of these guys have big games at the same time. It could happen. But I just think, you got to have pick and choose between these two guys. But, when I look at this team going forward, and especially for fantasy purposes, you have to treat Trevor Siemian as a quarterback too. And if Paxton Lynch somehow improves dramatically and happens to have like a Dak Prescott type of year, then you have to probably put him on the radar too. And that will probably make maybe Demaryius Thomas, Emmanuel Sanders a receiver 1. So that's something that you have to consider as well. But, the Broncos and John Elway, they have not have any expression on Tony Romo. But, to be fair, John Elway can't really comment on that. But I would love to see Tony Romo on the Broncos because of what he can do for this offense. And, we can't disregard the running game as well. This running game was kind of non-existent last year. They had C.J. Anderson, Devontae Booker. I do think those guys are going to be better. They improved on their offensive line this year, so I think the running game is going to be there. And this will really help Trevor Siemian or Paxton Lynch, whoever is there. But it looks like John Elway, he is very confident in these two young guys. And, when you're in fantasy, I'm not confident in these two young guys in fantasy. So you kind of have to pretty much draft Demaryius Thomas and Emmanuel Sanders kind of like you can't treat them like they're your best receiver on the team because you don't know they can have inconsistent numbers due to the quarterback play. All right, well, I'm going to take my first break, and when I get back, I'm going to discuss the quarterback situation in Houston when I get back to Going to Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
And welcome back to Going to Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast. And, I talked about the Denver Broncos in the last segment, but now another team that has been linked to Tony Romo is the Houston Texans. And it looks like they're just fine with the quarterback position as well. Well, according to Bill O'Brien, he thinks that, he likes what he has at the quarterback position right now. And he can't talk about Tony Romo either because, he is under contract with the Dallas Cowboys. And O'Brien did say at the annual league meetings in Phoenix that, they have two quarterbacks that will be there on April 17th, the beginning of their offseason program. And it will be Tom Savage or Brandon Whedon. So, as of right now, those are the only two guys that they have on the roster that are quarterbacks. They are Bill O'Brien said they're looking forward to those guys. And that's what they're planning. That's what they're going to the NFL draft with. But when this team, I honestly think if this team gets a quarterback, they're ready to go. And I think they can be a Super Bowl contender. But it looks like, it can be Brandon Whedon and Tom Savage in a preseason battle for the starting quarterback position. And, Savage did start a couple of games last year because of the terrible play of Brock Osweiler. But, he does have the arm to open up a really restricted offense, and he does understand O'Brien's system a little bit. So, from that point, I do kind of get what he's saying. But from a fantasy football standpoint, I'm not too high on many of the guys on this Houston team. I think with Lamar Miller, I think he's someone that's going to be a workhorse again. Because remember, he did have 268 rushes. He did have a 4-point. He did average 4 yards a carry. He only had 5 touchdowns, though, and that seems kind of low for me. But I do think he's someone that's going to, be a workhorse in this offense again. And when you look at guys like DeAndre Hopkins, I think he has the ability to be a top 5 receiver in this league. But, man, he just didn't have the numbers to back it up last year. He was wily. He had games where he was nowhere to be found. And maybe that's because Brock Osweiler didn't know where he was. But I am surprised to see that he did draw 150 targets. And I thought it was a lot lower than that. But, when you look at DeAndre Hopkins' stats from last season, he does have 954 yards. He has 78 receptions and only 4 touchdowns. The touchdown number I felt like should be way up. But I'll tell you right now, if Tony Romo goes to this team, DeAndre Hopkins is a top 5 receiver in fantasy. I think he can be. And I think Will Fuller, who drew 92 targets last year, I think he can be really good too. But, the thing about Will Fuller is that, he had problems with drops in college, and he had problems with drops last year too as well. So, Will Fuller, I think he can be a fantasy sleeper. He's a pretty deep sleeper though, so I wouldn't kind of overvalue him a little bit. But I think he's someone you can probably, draft in the last round. He had 635 yards, 47 receptions, and did have 2 touchdowns. But he did have 11 receptions of 20+ yards. So, he's someone that can get the field open too on those deep passes. And, of course, we got CJ Fedorowicz. That is Anthony's boy, who does a show with me here on Friday. He drew 89 targets and had as much touchdowns as DeAndre Hopkins had before. So, these are probably the 3 main guys that, would improve dramatically if Tony Romo were to be there. So, getting back to this, the Houston offense here, I do think Savage is a guy that can pretty much be a bridge guy, kind of like a 1-year starter type of deal. But this is a team that is kind of ready to make a deep postseason run, and this is a great defense too. So I think if they can't find a quarterback, they're going to waste his defense away. So maybe they can look into the draft to get someone else. Well, they currently right now, Tony Romo is still a part of the Cowboys. I have no idea why he's still on that team, but he's still part of the Cowboys. So the Cowboys are either going to trade or probably release him. And if the Cowboys do release Tony Romo, you bet that Houston is going to go after him. Because I understand why Denver and Houston don't want to trade for Tony Romo. That's just way too much money. But man, I'm telling you right now, from a fantasy football standpoint, Tony Romo really impacts the players on these 2 teams. And Romo's injury history, you do have to be a little concerned about that. So I can definitely see why Bill O'Brien would not be interested in bringing in Tony Romo. But I think Tom Savage could be a real good backup too, just in case that does happen. Just in case. But, it remains to be seen what happens to these 2 squads, the Texans and the Broncos, when it occurs when, Tony Romo does become available, whenever that does happen. And I do think that Houston will draft a quarterback. I don't think Denver will draft a quarterback. They just drafted one last year. But I really think that DeAndre Hopkins can have a bounce-back year with Tom Savage because, Brock Osweiler just couldn't find him. I think DeAndre Hopkins is one of those guys that, he can kind of bounce back a little bit. He did draw 150 targets, so that is something that's encouraging to me. But, I think with Tony Romo there, he has to be on the radar to be a top 5, fantasy receiver. All right, well, I am going to take my final break. And when I get back, I'm going to discuss Jason Witten. He signed a 4-year extension with the Dallas Cowboys, so I'm going to discuss the Cowboys tight end when I get back to Going to Me Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines, they got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
And welcome back to Going to Me Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast. And this morning, on March 28th, I did record this show. It's about almost 10 o'clock here on the West Coast. Well, this morning, Jason Witten signed a 4-year contract extension with the Dallas Cowboys that is good through 2021, and that will max out at a $29.6 million deal, but that does not include more guarantee money, and it gives both sides a peace of mind where Jason Witten will play beyond this season because, Witten was entering the final year of his contract. He's turning 35 in May. They restructured the deal. Okay, it looks like it's good for both sides. So this is the 4th contract extension that Jason Witten has signed with the Cowboys since he was a 3rd-round pick in 2003. And ever since his, not his rookie year, but ever since 2004, he's had at least 60 receptions. And that is pretty impressive, I might add. He had a pretty great stretch from 2007 to 2013 when he was one of the top tight ends in the game. He had at least 100 targets in those years from 2007 to 2013. Jason Witten is not that type of tight end anymore, especially for a lot of fantasy players. His role has changed due to, the Cowboys transitioning to a run-first team. And we all know that Ezekiel Elliott is probably a top 3 fantasy player heading into this year. But, Jason Witten, he was serviceable at times. He was one of those guys that, you can rely on during the bye week. He's not going to be your tight end 1. But he is someone that is reliable when you have someone on the bye because, tight end is a very, very, very limited position. So, looking to next season, or I should say, looking at the overall work of Jason Witten, no one has caught more passes. No one has played more consecutive games or started more consecutive games than Jason Witten. So that does speak to the reliability standpoint that Jason Witten is always going to be reliable for you. And, by the second game of the 2017 season, he will play in more games than any Cowboy in history. That is pretty impressive. And he needs 17 more yards to break Michael Irvin's team mark of 11,904. And Witten only needs 13 catches to move into the top 5 in league history. He will pass Chris Carter if that happens. Only Tony Gonzalez will have more catches than him. But, it looks like Jason Witten, with the way that his game has evolved to just a run blocker, he can still catch the football. He's not involved a lot like he used to be. They are a run-first team. Ezekiel Elliott is pretty much the catalyst of the offense now. You got Dak Prescott throwing it to Cole Beasley or Dez Bryant. Jason Witten, he's still a great player in this league, but, for fantasy purposes, I do think he's someone that is good enough for you to have when you have someone on the bye. So if you have like Jimmy Graham, or if you have someone like a Greg Olsen, Gronkowski, or let's just say like a mid-tier tight end like Tyler Eifert, let's just say if you have someone like that, like a Zach Ertz type of thing, he can be good for a bye week if you end up drafting those type of guys. But I do think that this is mainly a move to being a leader in the team, and that doesn't do anything for fantasy guys. But I just wanted to throw that out there. But if you look at the overall impressive work that he's had, he's been a Cowboy his whole life. It's tough to play for the same team your entire career. Like, another player that, has played his entire life, basically, is the New England Patriots, and that is Tom Brady. So, Tom Brady is one of those guys that has played his entire life as a Patriot. And, Robert Kraft did say that he can possibly play 6 to 7 years. Tom Brady told him that. He can play 6 to 7 years. And I talked about this more on the football show if you guys want to take a listen to that. But honestly, Tom Brady playing into his 40s, I don't know about that. I do heading this year, though. I can tell you this year, Tom Brady is someone that he's a rogue. He's going to be a fantasy quarterback again. I think he's going to be a top 5 fantasy quarterback. That's probably due to the Brandon Cooks acquisition there. And, you got guys like Rex Burkhead. I think he can be a sleeper. But, with Brady heading to this year and possibly playing into his mid-40s, that's going to impact Jimmy Garoppolo and wherever he goes. So that's going to impact Jimmy G, who enters the final year of his contract. But from a fantasy football perspective, this year I think Brady is still going to be one of the top quarterbacks because of the weapons that surrounded him. He just has too many people to throw to. You got Gronkowski coming back. You still got Julian Edelman there, but I think his production might fall off a little bit because there's so many people that Tom Brady can throw to. And, of course, you got Brandon Cooks. Brandon Cooks is going to be a star for this team, depending how long he is there. But I think Brandon Cooks is someone that's going to elevate this offense in an entirely new way. So, Brandon Cooks is probably the guy that everyone is excited for. I think Brandon Cooks is going to be drafted probably early second round, late second round. He's not going to go past the second round because when you have Tom Brady as your quarterback, you're going to have a lot of numbers. So that's the reason why Gronkowski is always in the first round mock drafts, because of his ability to pretty much beat Gronk, and he has Tom Brady as his quarterback. So, yeah. All right, well, that's going to conclude it for me today. I'd like to thank you guys for tuning in. I will come back on Friday. Anthony will be here as well. We will discuss any type of fantasy football-related things, anything that comes up this week, anything. But I'd like to thank you guys for tuning in. I'm Jeremiah. This was the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast, and you can follow the show on a variety of platforms on social media. And as for the listening platforms, you can listen to us on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, SoundCloud, YouTube, and on the website gsmcpodcast.com. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. The Twitter and Instagram handle is at @GSMC_FFootball, and Facebook, the Going to Meet Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast. All right, as always, I'm Jeremiah, and you guys have a great day.